Hi, welcome back, everyone. This is your friend Greedy Fanfics, bringing you another fanfiction. Today, we're diving into the first part of What If Deku had mimicking Quirk. All credit for this story goes to Mimas, so please support them by checking out the link in the description for more details. Don't forget to give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you want more content like this. Now, let's get into the fanfic. Izuku stirs awake to the sound of the waves outside and spends a few moments mourning the loss of sleep as he curls under the covers. The early morning spring chill sweeps the smell of seaweed and salt into the cat house, tickling his nose. Finally, he gives in, blinking his eyes open. He's woken up with the sun today, surrounded by balls of heat and fur, including one that's right behind his head purring like a jet engine and making his eyeballs feel like his skull is vibrating. The warm, furry arm laying over the side of his neck slides and big toe beans flex against his throat as he lifts his head, propping himself up on his elbow. He raises a hand to rub his eyes and attempts to push messy green curls out of his face, noting the texture as grimy, tacky, and in desperate need of a wash, only for them to sink right back to where they were on his forehead. His back pops as he moves to sit up, careful not to disturb any of the cats around him. The biggest fur ball behind him, Kobe, presses his paws, that are half the size of Izuku's hands, against his back as he also gets up, stretching and not half as careful as Izuku is when he stands and winds his way around the other cats with more grace than a cat that size has any right to have. Izuku stretches his arms before moving to follow, cherry-picking his foot placements so he doesn't step on anyone. The air nips at his skin even through his jacket, sending shivers skittering up and down his spine. He rubs his arms in a half-hearted effort to retain some of the rapidly dissipating warmth from his covers. He peeks outside to see the sky just barely starting to fade into halos of light gray and blue, the orange on the horizon peaks over the mountains of garbage. It's a little earlier than he usually wakes, not by much, but enough that he can take his time. Normally the sun is already starting to crest between the junk mounds when he pokes his head out in the morning. Since he's got an extra half hour or so, he can do some of the chores before he heads out instead of when he gets home tonight. He goes to the corner, narrowly missing stepping on Colby's tail, and searches the plastic bucket to find the wire brush before sitting down again, crisscrossing his legs. The heaping gray cat plops himself in his lap like a giant furry pillow the size of his torso, claiming his usual spot. The motor-like purrs increased as the brush drags through his tangled fur. He's glad Colby likes to be brushed. He's not sure he'd even be able to catch him and brush out the matting that comes with being a stray if Colby didn't cooperate. The spoiled lion of a cat lounges across his lap while the others wake up and stretch, some wandering outside already and a few coming over to nudge Izuku or meow at him for pets and scratches. When he's done with Colby, he moves on to Millie, the second fluffiest cat in the clouder, expertly twisting his torso so he could reach around Colby, who refuses to move, as usual. The black cat with white across her shoulders, neck, and mouth, meows at Colby and moves closer to Izuku, seating herself right beside his thigh. Izuku snorts when she pushes Colby's face out of the way with her paw and refuses to let him turn his head in any way that would detract Izuku's attention from her. After brushing the cats that stick around instead of immediately leaving to start their days, his stomach twists sharply with the warning cramps that mean painful growls are not far behind. With a sigh, Izuku finally commits a crime and shifts, more like shimmies, Colby from his lap. The stormy cat gives him the stink eye to end all stink eyes, scandalized that Izuku would dare do such a thing, and stalks out like a proud rich woman scorned. Izuku doesn't pay any mind to him. He does this every time he's shooed from his throne, and if Izuku were to stay put, he'd be back in a few minutes to reclaim his spot like nothing happened. He stands, dusting his hands off, and tries his best to brush the fur off his lap before gathering it up to throw outside. Immediately upon stepping outside, he wants to go back in. The towers of junk create a gentle whistle as the sea breeze slides between them. It makes him glad the cat house is enclosed, or it would be much colder. Still, it's not as bad as winter. He only needed 2 quilts to sleep last night instead of the 4 the household huddles under during the snowy months. By now, though, the sun is finally shining, even if it does nothing about the chill and won't until it's had a few hours to soak into the earth. He resists the urge to crawl back into bed as he yawns, stretching one final time to release his muscles, reaching his arms above his head, and feeling the tension in his back melt away with the delightful strain, giving him a little head rush. He likes slow mornings like this, with time to wake up properly, but it's time to get going. He ducks back into the house, now devoid of cats as they've all wandered off, and makes short work of his clothes, stacking them in the corner with his blankets while checking his mental schedule. Yesterday was a scrap day, so today is a cat day, and tomorrow he'll do another scrap day because he's going to need more money. Maybe he can search the beach for another microwave oven? That got him a decent amount of cash last time, and they're not that difficult to carry. It might look suspicious if he brings big items like that to the recyclers too often, though. They might think he's stealing them, like that person who was accused of exactly that last week. Izuku doesn't want to have to tell them he got it from here because not only is there a chance someone will come to verify it, but it could also end up with word getting out, and then the beach will be crawling with other people, and before you know it, there'll be no more junk beach, no more cat house, and his butt in a car headed back to the foster home, if he doesn't get arrested for illegally squatting here first. Don't get him wrong, it would be great for the environment if the beach was cleaned up, but not for Izuku. Izuku would avoid the place too if it wasn't for the fact that he can become adequately small and agile to make it less dangerous. He's always careful, especially around the rusty metals, and the paths he's built/cleared are plenty safe. For furry felines at least. It's safe for him and the Clouder because of the rolling hills of junk, and no one else is sufficiently insane, brave, or desperate enough to live out here, so he's left alone. Speaking of which, a shiver sweeps up his spine and Izuku quickly wishes to be a cat, fur sprouting all over him as he shrinks down. His muscles and bones contort and shift in just a few seconds to a shape that's become much more comfortable with use. It's second nature to be a cat now. Izuku stalks outside just as the others had, the sand pushing uncomfortably between his toes, but unlike the rest of the Clouder, he goes to the other side of their small clearing to a large patch of a black, powdery substance, and lays down. He carefully rolls his fur in the dark, grimy mixture of different kinds of dirt and soot, making sure to get it all over, sparing no part of his body. His stomach is a little difficult to coat properly, as is his head, but after 10 minutes he stands in the dirt with a thick layer of it clinging to his fur, covering all traces of the green with black, making him look like any other dirty alley cat in the area. The mixture itches if he leaves it on for too long, but being a green cat on the street is a dead giveaway for an animal with a quirk, which has unexpected consequences that he only needed to learn about the hard way once. At least something good came out of that experience. He double-checks himself in the reflection of the only window on the half-crushed car nearby to make sure all the forest green fur is hidden before nodding to himself and jumping up onto the roof. His steps are light, and the wooden board barely even creaks under his weight as he crosses the handmade path with grace only a cat could possess, all the way to the edge of the street above the beach. He hops down the concrete wall and looks both ways, flicking his ears for signs of speeding cars and loud music before quickly crossing. He doesn't want to get run over by the sudden appearance of any cars whipping around corners at velocities that would get them not just ticketed but arrested if it wasn't for speeding being the least of the local police's worries in this area. He trots along the sidewalk, his dirty paws leaving little footprints for a block before they're coated in enough dry dust and chalky dirt from the sidewalk to stop leaving tracks. Izuku dodges around someone and narrowly avoids a half-hearted kick in his direction. "Ugh, stupid cat! Scram, filthy thing!" she huffs, continuing her way to the hostess club, her heels clicking. He watches her walk away from a safe distance, making sure she's leaving and won't come back before he starts moving again. He carefully avoids the passers-by who give him dirty and disgusted looks, giving them a wide berth, as he makes his way closer to the center district where all the shops are. 8 out of 10 times people leave him alone, but he's wary of every person because of those other two. His fur stands up as he feels the eyes of the street on him. His anxiety always rises when someone is looking at him, and he always knows when he's being looked at. He knows better than to ignore that tingly sensation on the back of his neck or the way his fur stands on end, and he can feel where the gaze is coming from. It never takes long to track it. Thankfully, it's usually a false alarm or not serious enough that he needs to act, but sometimes people will try to scare him off or outright attack him, even if he's not doing anything, so he tries to keep on his toes. Alleyways are comforting for that reason. There are only so many directions he has to worry about. He sticks to the shadows as much as he can, splitting his attention between avoiding things on the ground, watching where he's going, and keeping an eye on his surroundings. Most eyes only linger on him for a second as he zips by, just checking what the movement in the corner of their eye was before disregarding him. He's gotten pretty good at sneaking around unnoticed, but there are a few places between alleys and certain blocks that are wall-to-wall buildings, and you can't avoid hugging them or running along the side of the road to get to the next alley. Unfortunately, it's inevitable to pass at least one of these spots, no matter what route he takes for the day for whatever he's doing, be it food, the recycling center, or trying to head to a different district. Even though each one of those is in a different direction, if he's coming from the beach, the routes branch out like roots of a weed. He scampers past the rundown buildings and the roads with more potholes and patches than asphalt until the impending growl of his stomach finally comes with a familiar, painful stab. Just a little farther. He scampers past the hardware store and disappears into the alley beside it, checking that it's empty before running to the middle. He jumps up, using the bins next to the dumpster to climb until he can get on the cinder block wall running between two buildings and take what he likes to call cat paths. These paths are too small for people but perfect for cats, and it cuts down the amount of walking he has to do. Plus, they're safer, and the fewer chances he takes every day, the better. The only people up and about at this hour are those getting ready to open the dilapidated shops and people who have yet to go to bed. Everyone else is fast asleep, savoring their precious few hours before they have to get up and conduct their dangerous, shady activities again. He pokes his head out into the alley at the end of the path and turns into it, continuing along the wall as far as he could before jumping down onto some empty delivery crates and crossing the alley. This is technically a low-income area, but honestly it's become a place for low-ranking criminals to hang out where no one will look too closely at them or ask too many questions rather than for people who are actually struggling with poverty. Granted, most crime is a byproduct of poverty in the first place, so maybe it's inevitable for these places to become like this. Most around here can at least make ends meet, but there's just enough of a homeless population for it to still be classified as low-income and not a criminal hotspot. Yet. This means there's fewer heroes that patrol the area, especially overground ones, and the cops are pretty much just here to stop bar fights and keep tabs on the overall criminal activity, making sure it remains a quiet area on the surface. In short, so long as no one starts shootouts in the middle of the day and no other high-profile criminals settle in, nobody will care. The bulk of crime happens at night, and this place is no exception, but he's careful about how late he stays out. A few times a month he'll be out past sundown, but usually, he returns to the cat house before then. Cats are nocturnal creatures, so sometimes the instinct to stay out can be hard to fight, but when he gets home and changes back to human, the wave of tiredness always hits him like a brick. Just thinking about that makes his jaw stretch and creak as it pulls in a sharp-toothed, tongue-curling yawn. He licks his whiskers on the sides of his mouth as he hurries down the dark, slim passage to the back of the first stop on his route today. The passage is narrow enough that an adult would have to turn sideways and shimmy to pass through it, but his furry shoulders barely brush the walls as he strolls down, sniffing the air as he comes out of the back to the cramped space behind the shop. There's always a rat or a mouse or two back here because of the food waste dumpsters. Once he reaches a good spot, he crouches, beginning the long wait with his tail occasionally flicking and sharp eyes scanning the deep shadows for movement. After 10 minutes of his ears swiveling on his head at the slightest sounds, he hears it, a tiny, barely audible squeak. Izuku's shoulders wiggle as he hikes his dark fuzzy butt into the air, with eyes trained sharp in anticipation. The moment a little brown head pokes out and tries to run across the cold, dirty ground, his muscles tighten, and he pounces. Sharp, curled claws swiftly dig into the mouse's back until something crunches and the rodent falls limp. Less than a second, that wasn't too bad. It shouldn't suffer, unlike his first few had. He shakes the prickle of guilt away and opens his mouth, delicately taking the furry skin of the tiny rodent in his teeth. He brings the tiny corpse to the open back door protected by a screen, only to quickly step back when he sees a customer inside the little convenience store. He waits with his ear turned to the side for the bell chime and the murmur of pleasantries between the departing customer and the teller to cease before peeking his head around the corner and stepping into sight again. His neck dips to set the rodent down before raising again to let out a cracked, squeaky meow, immediately catching the part-timer's attention. Her eyes soften when they find him and Izuku meows again, batting at the mouse on the ground. The girl smiles and gets up, grabbing something from behind the counter before making her way over. She's new, only having worked here for a few weeks, but the owner had introduced them during her very first shift. He steps back so she can open the door and shoots the dead mouse a disgusted glance while she sets down a shallow tin, the expiration date on the side being for 3 days ago. Technically it's still edible, they just can't sell it. Good kitty. Keep those nasty things away from here. She looks like she's going to give him a chin scratch, but her brow twists a little, looking at his fur and immediately rethinking touching a dirty stray cat that just killed a rodent. There isn't much in this little can, but Izuku meows his itadakimasu as he dips his head to eat the leftover scraps from some kind of canned meat. It's hard to tell what kind between the cold gravy and the old smell. Expired food, and especially expired meat, doesn't taste the best, but pretty much anything is better than roadkill, and having meat at all is practically a delicacy. The day is off to a good start. He flinches at the unexpected touch on his back but keeps eating, letting the cashier pet him after all, through a latex glove she must have had in her pocket. She usually gives him a little scratch on his head or chin and washes her hands before going back to work. He isn't particularly fond of being touched unexpectedly, but if he lets her scratch his head, she'll usually get him some water too unless she's interrupted by a customer. Today she seems to be in a better mood than usual. That, or she's finally getting used to him so she's getting bolder about touching him. He wouldn't say he likes being touched by strangers, but he doesn't not like it either. It makes his stomach tingle with anxiety having someone touch him, especially while he eats. But for some clean, clear water from a tap instead of a road puddle or leaky hose, it's a small price to pay. Today he's in luck, nobody comes into the store, and when he finishes eating and looks up at the woman, she smiles and takes the tin, going inside. He paces for a minute outside until she comes back with the same tin. Gravy water doesn't taste the best, but the semi-cold liquid soothes his throat, quenching his morning thirst, even if it hits his stomach like a rock in a well. After he's done, the part-timer takes the tin back inside, marking the end of their transaction. She goes back to work, and he drags the dead mouse away from the door with his paw, not wanting it to be anywhere near his mouth again now that it's been sitting long enough for the blood to congeal into sticky clumps. He doesn't want to leave it by the door where it'll start smelling or someone could step on it. He only brings the rodents for proof that rewarding him for killing things around their buildings is worth it, anyways. Plus, the shops give him more food and treat him better if he cleans up after himself. The painful barbs in his belly fade, but it still growls at him as he heads off to search all the usual spots where there's easy pickings for food. If you can get there early enough. Dumpsters behind restaurants, trash cans, shops that will preemptively put food out on occasion to attract the strays and keep the rodents down, etc. Those ones taste the best and they're the most filling, but it's random and the food is usually gone as soon as it's put out, so Izuku never goes there first. He always goes to the most reliable spots first, instead of wasting time and energy on the iffier ones until after he's checked all the trusty places. Unfortunately, his luck doesn't hold. He searches the 6 other shops that will feed him in exchange for pest control and hangs out for a good half hour at each one, but he doesn't catch a single other thing. With nothing to show for his efforts, none of these places will just feed him, either because the ones minding the shops are the owners who only see it as wasting profits, or they're part-timers who have sympathy for him but aren't allowed to feed the strays for no reason because the owners don't want the strays to stop hunting around the buildings. It's too late to go back for the mouse he killed at the first store and bring it to the others. He hasn't had to use that trick since winter, so he didn't think to. Stupid. Most of the shop owners are decent people, but they're not that nice. No prey, no pay. There are plenty of other strays around here that can kill rodents. Izuku is just the only one smart enough to seek a reward, and the shopkeepers get a kick out of having a smart cat around, but not too smart. He's careful not to show any abnormal intelligence, no matter how nice a person seems or how tempting it is to use it to his advantage. He learned that lesson well the first time. He doesn't need a reminder. He tries to behave more like a cat when he's out. Sometimes it comes easy, other times he doesn't quite get the hang of it, and some people are just a little too sharp to be fooled completely no matter how flawless his acting is. The best way to fool those people is to be reticent. Not too friendly, not too interactive, basically just ignore most of what they say and do, even if he is listening, and avoid looking at them, especially in the eyes. Don't ever look a person directly in the eyes because consciousness can be seen so easily through the eyes. If he has to look at someone's face, he'll look at their mouth, their nose, eyebrows, count their eyelashes, whatever. Just avoid the pupils. Izuku's tail flicks idly beside him as he sits on the dumpster lid, looking out at the darkened street. The sun went down half an hour ago, and he was going to head home, but, while he may not come to hunt in this alley anymore, it's still a nice place to find food, and he just so happened to see a worker from the pizza place dump some boxes here as he was passing by, and what cat can resist lounging after eating their fill? It's rare that he gets to fill his belly and take a minute to be lazy afterwards. Forgive him for taking the opportunity. Honestly, this leftover pizza has saved his day. He thought he was going to have to dip into the food reserves tonight after his rotten luck all day. He looks down at his blackened paws laying in front of him, the pads covered in a thin layer of concrete dust, and resists the urge to lick them clean. His dirt cover is still caked on, so it wouldn't taste very good, even if there is a little splash of pizza sauce on his toe beans from stepping on the cardboard. Instead, he flicks his tail again and looks around with sleepy, slow-blinking eyes, enjoying the sensation of a full belly and a rare moment devoid of the buzz of anxiety under his skin. It's strange. He's not worried about coming back here, to this alley where it all started, and where one of the worst experiences of his life happened. He keeps an eye out, he's not stupid, but it's less from worry and more his normal vigilance. His ears still flick every which way, and he turns his head to investigate every unfamiliar sound, but thankfully they're few and far between tonight, which means his chest begins to rumble softly. A rare moment of purring when he's by himself. Sometimes he wishes he could control when that happens, but it's like trying to suppress a cough when you're choking. Not worth it, and pretty much impossible even at the best of times. Plus, purring calms him down when he's stressed. It makes him feel comfortable. Like a form of self-care, and care in general because it happens when the others at home are distressed too. A built-in, all-purpose calming mechanism. A glitter of amusement whisks through his eyes and his tail flicks quickly a few times in delight. Not even the loveliest moments can stay forever though, and as the minutes tick by the anxiety creeps its way back in, but he doesn't want to move yet, desperate to cling to every bit of momentary peace before he has to go back to having his nerves so taut they could be used as guitar strings. He's fine. Everything's fine. It's not unusual to see a black cat with bright green eyes, and those rumors about him died out a long time ago. The locals, at least, believe he was trafficked and is long gone, taken to some zoo or sanctuary where the rare, Quirk animals of the world are looked after. Either way, nobody talks about the green cat anymore, so he's safe, and more than grateful. He's okay to hang out here while his tummy settles. Nothing bad will happen to him in the few minutes he's just sitting here, and if something does happen, he can run away. His paws stretch and relax again and again, his claws adding more lines to the scuffed, dirty plastic lid. The alley still doesn't feel as safe as it once did, but despite that, his fondness for it hasn't faded. It still holds a special place in his heart. He wouldn't say it feels like home anymore, but it's a familiar place, like a friend's house, or a corner store near your home that's been there for as long as you can remember. He spends a good amount of time here, usually during the day, collecting food, people watching, or stalking around for information that'll help further the freshly stoked fire of his dream that had almost gone out. When he first came here, it took a while before he figured out his day-to-day as a cat and got a handle on his situation, enough to get time to think, to test, to regret some of those tests, to learn the dangers of his new world and how to navigate them, and finally become practiced at finding enough food every day, or near enough, that his head doesn't swim when he tries different transformations. With experimentation finally being an option, he's been able to figure out so much of his quirk. It's still nowhere near as much as he'd like, but he's tentative to try some of his ideas because he can't afford a hospital visit for testing quirk limits. He's hesitant to push his luck and has only been able to test some softer limitations. He's going to make his dream happen. He has an idea of how, of where to start, and he has a plan. It's all down to the execution now. He's shooting to be a hero. He'll aim carefully, and if the first shot misses, he'll try again, and when he runs out of ideas, he'll come up with new ones. It doesn't matter if it takes him a lifetime, he's going to be a hero. He's getting enough food nowadays that he's been able to train somewhat. He's not very good at it yet, but he's way better than he used to be, and he can feel the difference. The obstacle courses he's set up on the beach may not be much. They were originally just cat paths to make getting to the cat house easier for the whole clouder, but it's better than nothing. He set up more complicated ones for his training, and it's been amusing for some of the group as well, though they tend to fall more often than he does. Figuring out what he can do is tough, spending hours wherever he can spare them racking his brain for what to try next, but it'll be useful for hero work, especially since he's rushing to catch up with other people who've had their quirks their whole lives. His experience with his quirk is next to none compared to others, particularly people like Kaken who haven't stopped using their quirks since the day they got it, never mind pro heroes who have training. He knows how to be a cat, but that's all he really knows how to be. He knows how to transform into several other animals, like a jackrabbit, squirrel, crow, but he doesn't have a lot of experience with them for reasons. That aside, he knows which ones he can do without risk, and he has a good list in his head of ones that would be useful that he should be able to, but he can't really test out the bigger ones. Even if he could, he can't do it safely, and he's not in a position to take that risk. Izuku sighed heavily, straining his limbs, and stretching out, shaking off the train of thought that threatened to spiral into another long night of wondering what he's capable of, and when he'll get the chance to find out. An endless rabbit hole of problem-solving that he's devolved into far too often. A path that brings nothing but antsy feelings with nowhere to put them. For now, he'll just... Izuku's train of thought was brutally derailed by a shriek that sent him jumping literally 2 feet in the air and landing on the dumpster lid with an echoing thud. A moment later the shriek cut off like it had been stifled, and his head whipped back behind him. His fur bristled like every strand was being pulled up by a magnet, and even with superior dark vision, it was still difficult to sort out what he was seeing. There were 2 people further down the alley, leaning against the wall. Oh! His eyes widened. There, he shouldn't be, he should give them some sigh. Horror dawned over him, and he froze, taking in the young woman's terror-stricken face. That's not consensual. His heart pounded in his ears like a subwoofer. What is he supposed to do? What are you supposed to do when this? He has to do something, get help or what should he do? Help her! His subconscious screamed, and like it slammed a big red button in his brain, his legs jolted, and he ran before his mind could totally catch up, some protective, territorial, or whatever instinct hijacking his whole body as he raced down the alley. He barely had time to think of what to do before he leapt off the ground onto some bins beside the 2 and jumped again, claws extended as he collided with the man's face. His front claws dug into warm skin with a piercing, confused scream from the man, sinking into his neck and cheek while his back claws sank into the fabric over his chest. He barely heard himself yowling and hissing over the man's startled shouts as he clawed and raked and batted, the flurry of movement all over the place, making it almost impossible to tell what he was actually hitting, but the man was shocked and terrified enough to stumble back onto the ground, tripping over those earlier pizza boxes Izuku had devoured and left where they lay in the damp alley. The man's back hit the ground and Izuku took the chance to spring off him, racing in a circle as he struggled to get his bearings on which way the end of the alley is. But his ear caught the sound of stumbling heels and his feet moved that direction before his eyes caught up and he could see where he's going. It wasn't 2 seconds before he had caught up with the woman who was too drunk to run in a straight line but was crying and wheezing nonetheless, the gills on the side of her neck struggling to filter air from the inflated water necklace she wore. "Follow me." Izuku meowed at her with urgency, forgetting that cats can't speak human, and ran in front of her. Thankfully she got the message, staggering after Izuku as he led her to another alley, one that was big enough for a human to pass through. The police station is too far from here, and he doesn't know a fast way there that she can fit through. The shops are all closed already. Think, where can they find help? The cafe. The 24-hour cafe 2 blocks from here. There's always an officer or two there because they give free refills to night shifters. A low hull set Izuku's nerves crackling. The instinct of becoming something's prey overwhelmed his entire body and pushed him faster. He barely remembered to yowl again as he darted around a corner, making sure the woman could still follow even though it's dark and he doubts she has night vision like he does. Her quirk seems aquatic-based. Her crying had turned to desperate panting. Her heels slapped the ground in an uneven run, and he's getting seriously worried about the wheezing sound of her gills. She might not be getting enough oxygen to keep this up. Almost there, just a little farther, just a little farther. Izuku's desperate assurances came out as a scramble of meows, scaring off anything else that had been in the alley, mice and bugs alike skittering out of their path into hiding. Then Izuku heard a sharp yelp and a loud smack into the ground. He skidded to a halt, almost falling on his side, and whipped his head around. The shimmery patches of scales on her arms and cheeks glinted like a neon sign in the dirty yellow light from the end of the alley, glistening red as they were scratched up and bleeding from her skidded fall. Her broken heel stuck like a sword from a stone in the sewer grate behind her. "No, no, no!" Izuku ran back, watching in terror as yellow eyes appeared at the end of the alley, glowing just like Izuku's do in the dark, and the eyes fixed on the woman a moment later. "You have to get up!" Izuku yelled, pushing against her side with his head, desperate to get her up. Just leave her shoes and run. But he realized in one horrifying second as the man dropped to all fours and ran at them faster than before, that she isn't going to make it even if she gets up right now and runs as fast as she can. There's no time. He ran behind the woman, near her feet, facing the man, his back arched so high it almost hurt. All his fur stood up and the loudest, most threatening hiss he's ever mustered bled out of him. It came out deeper and a little more jagged than a normal cat, more like a big cat. A big, predatory cat not native to this region of the world. He's not sure how he did that, but he didn't have time to think about it as it made the yellow-eyed man with coyote features hesitate. Izuku gave another warning hiss as he saw the man's eyes flicker to the clatter of noise and pained yelp behind him, just before the woman screamed with piercing volume, like a tsunami siren. "Help me! Please!" Izuku moved to block the man's path as he stepped forward and lashed out at his face now that it's nearer to the ground, giving him more fresh scratches as he swiped his eyes, startling the man into stumbling back again with a canine yelp of pain. If he were a real coyote this never would have worked, but because humans are still humans, they're skittish of unpredictable animals. It gives him this chance. The smell of blood wafted from his small sharp claws as his body shook with adrenaline, unknowingly adding to his feral look, but he kept jumping and batting and scratching, only one thought in his head: he will not let the man get past him. When he chased the man back far enough, Izuku risked a glance behind him while the man had his face covered with a paw-shaped hand, and saw the woman scrambling backwards on the ground, her terrified eyes glued to them and her twisted ankle dragging on the ground like it had no bones. Her cries had become hysterical, choking and sputtering while the fluid slowly leaked from her cracked water necklace, but she still tried to scream for help. The distraction cost him as his ear twitched with a footstep, and it was thanks to pure instinct that he jumped right as he felt the wind whoosh next to him and sweep underneath him as the man's foot aimed to kick him into the alley wall like a soccer ball. Izuku landed and didn't wait a second before pouncing on the upright man towering over them again, this time scrambling to climb the tall man. His shouts and the woman's continuous screaming pierced Izuku's tiny skull like railroad nails, but it only served to make his claws dig further and faster, which made the man flail and swing his arms, frantic to get Izuku off him. "Ack! Get off, you damn cat! I'll kill you!" A hand wrapped around Izuku's leg and yanked, and Izuku yelped, but so did the man as Izuku's claws tore free from his back, taking bits of flesh with him. An agonized howl tore from the man's maw as he threw Izuku away from him. Izuku landed on his feet and ran for it again, seeing the woman had made it to the street despite hobbling on her ankle. He ran for her again but made a desperate swerve towards the dumpster when a pair of black boots landed in front of him from nowhere. Izuku barreled into the side of the dumpster, a loud bang reverberating, but he didn't stop for a moment, darting behind it and jumping over broken cardboard and old fast food cups as fast as he could. A cacophony of noise broke out in the alley, shouting, voices, howls, and the telltale sounds of limbs striking bodies. Izuku could barely hear anything over his blood pounding in his ears, and the overwhelming smells of old, sticky mystery substances stuck to the garbage and walls. His mind raced. What if there were two of them? How would he protect that lady from two people? And she's hurt, she can barely walk. It didn't occur to him until he came out the other side that the newcomer was summoned by the shrieking tearing into the otherwise quiet night life, and Izuku whipped his luminous green eyes to the fight and froze, his kitty mouth dropping open. His eyes were glued in awe to Eraserhead, a little-known, notoriously difficult-to-find underground hero, who stands between him, the woman, and the coyote man who is wrapped like a mummy on the ground in Eraserhead's capture weapon, a weapon that Izuku has only ever found a handful of pictures of on the internet, all from Eraserhead's school days at UA more than a decade ago. The hero asked the woman if she was okay and called to alert the police via a tiny black hero comm in his ear. Izuku didn't realize that he's still sitting near the dumpster, starstruck, as the hero helped the woman patch the water tank for her gills with a temporary seal while they wait for the paramedics to arrive, and she started telling the pro what happened, thanking him profusely while tears streamed down her face in much thicker globs than normal, part of her quirk, Izuku would guess. Izuku shook his head to snap out of reverie, but he was sucked right back in. It's really Eraserhead, the Erasure hero. He's seen heroes before and still chases the fights to watch even now, but heroes rarely patrol this part of town. Daylight heroes steer clear of it. Heck, even the cops assigned to the station nearby barely patrol. He was not expecting Eraserhead to look at him when the woman pointed him out as this cat who came out of nowhere and saved her. Raw anxiety struck through him like it had been shot straight into his veins, and his tired limbs locked up and froze. He was not expecting Eraserhead to come towards him, much less pick him up. The sensation of his feet leaving the ground without his say-so made Izuku jolt, but instead of trying to struggle free, his claws dug into Eraserhead's black sleeve for dear life of their own volition. He felt like he was going to fall for 3 frantic seconds until there was something under him supporting his weight, and suddenly felt stable, encompassed in warmth that had no right to be so soothing to his crispy nerves. He couldn't help looking up, and another shout of panic bolted through him as he accidentally bonked his head on the hero's stubbled chin. He's freaking out, but of course his rat brain couldn't help taking note that Eraserhead is very good at holding cats. Despite the initial lifting and still being 5 feet off the ground, Izuku doesn't feel like he's going to fall like the other times he's been picked up in this form. He had no idea what to do though. He's never encountered anything like this. He wants to jump down but also doesn't, because the longer he sits here the warmer it gets, and he didn't notice before how cold he is, that he's shaking as the adrenaline slowly ebbs from his body, his claws unintentionally digging into Eraserhead's jumpsuit, and an ache settling into his muscles. He flinched when a hand gently touched his head. He's shaking. Is he okay? He jumped again at the woman's worried voice. She was so much closer now, eyes stained red and still crying, but looking at Izuku. He's frightened. Eraserhead answered shortly. Must have been a tough night for him. Should you be holding him? She asked. Eraserhead sighed and the fur on the back of Izuku's neck ruffled, but all over his body it was slowly settling. Normally I wouldn't, but he might be in shock. Cats can go into shock? The woman finally looked at Eraserhead instead of Izuku and he felt just the slightest bit of tension leave his body, until Eraserhead started stroking his head calmly. Yeah, the hero answered gruffly. How can you tell? She sniffled, her concerned glittery eyes looking down at Izuku again, her hand raised but she didn't touch him, like she was afraid she would make it worse. He appreciates her holding back because it really would. His heart's beating too fast, he's panting, and his ears and paws are cold. The fact he didn't run when I approached him means he might have been too weak to. No, he wasn't too weak, he was just running a lot and it was a scary experience, and then Eraserhead showed up and… Oh God, is he in shock? Is that what this is? Is this what shock feels like? He's really dirty. The woman looked at Eraserhead's hand, covered in black dust and grime. The hand brushed over his head a few more times before pale fingers slid through the fur around his neck. It took Izuku a minute to realize the man was searching for something. No collar. Probably a stray. Though they usually avoid people, not help them. Izuku is just thankful that in the darkness his fur is dark enough to still look black rather than green even if some of his dirt rubs off. However, his eyes are still a vivid dark green that certainly isn't natural, so he kept his eyes away from the woman's sight as best as he could and resolutely did not look up at the hero, no matter how desperate he was to observe everything around him. Thankfully, either of them has assumed he's anything but a normal cat. Maybe he's just a friendly little guy. The woman softly smiled at Izuku, and his anxiety lessened a fraction. Thank you, kitty. My little hero. Eraserhead's fingers curled and Izuku unwillingly relaxed as he started scratching his head. Thankfully he didn't start purring, and he spoke too soon. I think he likes you. The woman cooed, and gently raised her hand in front of Izuku's nose. His nose twitched at the unusual dirty smells, her injured hands covered in the stink of the alley floor, but because he didn't react, she must have taken that as an okay and moved to scratch his chin. If he could blush in this form, his face would be on fire. This is so embarrassing. He tried to just mentally grit his teeth and keep reminding himself that he's a cat right now. This reaction is completely normal, and it's completely normal for people to want to pet a cat, especially one that's just saved their life. It's fine. It's all normal. It's even normal that he's finding the heat against his side from Eraserhead's chest, relaxing. Everything's normal. What's gonna happen to him now? I'll take him to a vet who owes me a favor after the police arrive, and they'll take him to a shelter in the morning. Izuku's blood ran cold, and his involuntary purrs immediately stopped. And oh no, he can't go to a shelter, That's too bad. I kind of want to keep him. Worse. The distant sound of sirens distracted the two, and he saw his chance. He took advantage of the distraction and flipped out of Eraserhead's arms and took off down the alley. Logically he knows he can't outrun a pro hero, but what else is he supposed to do? Let himself get taken again? Become someone's pet or worse, go to that vet so they can find out he has a quirk and even find out he's a person not a cat and charge him with public quirk usage and get a criminal record and never be able to become a hero. Izuku flew down the alleyway and disappeared from the two adults' sight in a flash. Thankfully, the cops arrived shortly after and Eraserhead didn't chase him, in favor of talking to the officers and getting the villain dealt with. Izuku's heart was pounding so hard it hurt again. He felt a little dizzy and a bit sick to his stomach that had been sloshed around hard after being stuffed, but it's fine. It's all fine, so long as he doesn't end up in another shelter. He still has nightmares about that day. Waking up while someone tried to snatch him off the street. The only reason he even goes out anymore is because he started using dirt, and the soot and grease from old, junked cars on the beach to turn his fur too dark to tell that it isn't black. A black cat with green eyes is not as rare as a green cat, even if the green of his eyes is still unusually dark. He was tense and wary and hyper-aware of everything all the way home, being extra cautious and running even through exhaustion, and it didn't occur to him until he was safely back and tucked under a mound of cats what had just happened. He saved someone. Oh my God, he saved someone. She called him a hero. A cat suddenly became a boy again, and he scooped up frosting with a grin stretching across his entire face, and he couldn't help shouting, "I saved someone! And I met Eraserhead!" He recounted the entire story to his clouder, who couldn't have cared less but let him ramble all the same, his chest heaving and buzzing with excitement as he gave the required pets and scratches to keep them from scattering in the face of his animated, noisy recounting. Oh my God! All the blood drained from his face near the end of his story. It had occurred to him earlier, but he had been too busy being scared out of his wits to internalize it until now. I saved someone, while using my quirk without a license. And it was witnessed by a pro hero. His throat bobbed as he swallowed, a tiny whimper escaping as he tried to comfort himself. Don't panic. Izuku jolted awake, smothering himself into a face full of fur, and yanked his head back to rapidly take in his surroundings, and only when he recognized the cat house and no cage in front of him, did he drop his head down and try to steady his breaths again. It took a few minutes before he looked to see which cat fell asleep right in front of his face. The monocoloring is indicative, but he always feels the need to make sure it is one of his cats. Relief soothed over him to see it's Millie, her fluffy black back and white neck tickling his nose. He's torn between shoving his face back into her fur and going back to sleep and reaching up to violently rub his itchy nose and grind the heels of his hands into his eyes as if he can scrub the nightmare from his brain if he pushes hard enough. In the end, he chose the latter, and the cats around him wiggled and woke up when he moved to sit up, but most of them don't bother moving unless he bumps them. The only one that got up with him is Colby. The protective, stormy gray cat got up and followed as soon as he summoned up the energy to pull himself to his feet and wound around his ankles while he dug through the plastic bucket for a brush. Colby climbed into his lap as soon as Izuku sat back down and started purring up a storm even before the brush touched him. It reminds him of the first time he did this. He didn't know how the cats would react to him trying to brush them, but just like now, he had plopped down on his butt in the dim light of the sunrise, just enough to see, and pulled Colby closer to him. The cat complied and tried to climb into his lap but settled for just bracing his front paws on Izuku's ankle as he tentatively started brushing him. Colby had looked so confused at first, but soon the purring started and didn't stop. He's not sure who the familiar rhythmic motion soothed more, him or the cats, but it's a morning ritual at this point. Not one they do every day, but all the cats know it's a brushing day when he reaches for that bucket. Sometimes they try to groom him back, licking his legs and arms while he brushes. Colby purrs like a bus in his lap, making himself comfortable in his regal seat and blinking slowly in the rising light. Izuku spends the morning brushing the cats, and the only ones that make a fuss, as usual, are Kitters and Hunter, but that's more because either enjoy being touched as much as the others and less because of the brush. Sometimes they'll consent to being brushed when they're feeling loving, but most of the time they prefer to groom him when he's a cat. He pulled tufts after tufts of fur out of the brush as he went, tossing the clumps aside to pick up after they're all done, and he didn't realize just how much cat fur there is until he was picking up clumps of it in his hands to throw out into the junkyard, and he had to make 2 return trips. He brushed out all the matting he could on the cats. Not all of it will come out, but they keep each other pretty clean, so it's not too bad, not as bad as it used to be before he got this brush, and now they have hardly any matting at all. If they weren't so thin and mangy and unfriendly to strangers, they probably wouldn't even look like strays. Plus, no collars. Last night was cold, so it's a rare treat for all of them to be here at once. Usually, most of them will wander out at dusk and dawn. Cats are diurnal after all. But even so, he's rarely alone here in the cat house. Even at their most active times, there's usually 1 or 2 of them here with him, and they seem to rotate sometimes. Almost like they know he doesn't want to be alone when he's at the cat house. The only time Izuku's alone is during the day when he wanders around for food and school and stuff. Izuku put the brush away and stared at the bucket. This bucket, and the things inside, were worth getting. He just wishes the process of acquiring them wasn't so traumatic. It was a hard lesson learned, and he pays more attention now to his activities and who sees him. He's already been kidnapped once, and once is more than enough, thank you. After his experience at that shelter, he vowed to never let that happen again. He makes himself dirty to disguise his color, and slowly the reputation for the green cat faded until no one talked about it anymore. People assumed the cat, aka he, was taken. And a new black cat with green eyes on the street isn't noteworthy. There are at least 2 other cats who look just like him around here, and only the most observant of people in this area even realized there were 3 of them now, and not 2. Now he knows, when some shady person comes near him, especially at the end of the alley he usually hangs out at, he knows what's happening. Instead of getting taken again, the minute they get too close to him and aren't warned off by his hissing, he morphs into a dog and bites the shit out of their arms or legs before running away. He's only had to do that twice, and he hasn't heard any rumors or anything spreading about it, so he assumes they either don't live in this area or were too startled to tell anyone they got attacked by a cat that became a dog. Course, it was dark both times it happened anyway, so maybe they didn't even realize the cat and dog were the same. Izuku jumped when Colby meowed like it was a crime to not pay attention to him, and rammed his head against Izuku's shin hard enough that his knee bent a little. Not enough to knock him down, but Colby is a big cat. If he really tried, he probably could knock Izuku down. Izuku's not exactly the biggest teenager. Alright. Izuku reached down and hoisted the heavy giant cat into his arms, his head rushing as he straightened back up, 2 giant paws on his shoulders like wearing a hyper-realistic cat backpack on his front. One more cuddle, then I have to get ready for school, you big floof. Izuku snuggled into his fur as Colby butted and rubbed his head against Izuku, purring hard enough to vibrate Izuku's ribs. Izuku didn't expect to see Eraserhead ever again after that night. It was a 1,000,000 to 1 chance he saw him in the first place. This isn't the hero's operating area, at least from what little he knows of the underground hero. Information on underground heroes is tightly regulated after all. 3 days later, though, he's being forced to consider these alleys might be part of a new patrol route. Because he jumped out of his skin at the silhouette that somehow snuck up on him despite his vigilance. He's still on edge about that woman being attacked before, and dark figures creeping up on him in alleyways is never a good thing. He very nearly transformed ready to maul someone, or at least pretend he's a rabid enough animal to do that to a person. Thankfully, he had the good sense to follow his 2-step process of hissing first, and not immediately giving himself away as a quirked animal. The intruder crouched and a familiar gruff, flat voice drifted through the alley. You again. Izuku froze with an entirely different sort of fear. He saw the hand lowering, which normally would have been enough to send him running if it had been reaching towards him, but his instincts are at war with whether or not to move, and his eyes locked onto little light brown squares piled in the center of a rough palm. His nose tickled with an appetizing smell. Izuku stared at the hero warily. Is he trying to trick him? Get him to go over there, and then grab him so he can take him to a shelter? Or worse, does he know Izuku's not a real cat and intends to capture him and throw him in jail? No, that's ridiculous. There's no way Eraserhead can know he's not a real cat. A 5-minute interaction in the dark while Izuku was panicking before he took off like a bat out of hell is not enough time to determine whether or not he's a real cat, no matter how smart you are, and Eraser's quirk obviously doesn't work in a way that would tell him that, or Izuku would have been busted right away. Still, he should leave. But how can he get out of here without Eraserhead following him? There's no distraction this time, and nothing of more importance that requires the hero to let him go, and the nearest alley that won't let a person follow him is too short. The hero could beat him to the other side by going over the roof. Eraserhead sighed. You're more skittish than you seemed. Smart cat. Here. He put a few of the treats on the ground, giving them a gentle little toss towards Izuku, but made no move to do anything else. Don't worry, I'm not gonna take you to a shelter if you don't want to go. Izuku glanced at the squares, then back at Eraserhead, watching him with a calm, neutral face. Eraserhead sighed. Maybe you have been out here for a while if you're this cautious. Izuku stared at him for a bit longer, until his belly rumbled. The painful jabs moved his paws before he even registered what he was doing, and wolfed down the first of the tossed cat treats before it could even cross his mind that they might have been laced with sedatives or something. But on second thought, that doesn't make sense. You wouldn't need to lie to a cat. It's not like they can understand you, normally, and Mr. Eraserhead doesn't really seem like that kind of person. It wasn't long before he crept pretty close to the man, sniffing for any treats he may have missed, and found the last one in the man's palm. He hesitated but ultimately decided to snag it quickly. Treats aren't nearly enough to satiate his empty stomach, but it's enough to stop the hunger cramps for the moment. Even though he saw it coming out of the corner of his eye, he still flinched when Eraserhead's hand touched his back and lightly stroked his dirty fur. The movement is slow and measured while his other hand, now devoid of treats, stays firmly in Izuku's field of vision. It doesn't feel like it has any intent other than to just pet him. It's pretty easy to tell the hero is a cat person, and much quicker than Izuku should have, he began to relax. Not really registering exactly when the warmth began to seep into his chilled bones, just like last time. He unconsciously moved into the hero's space, getting as close to his body heat as he could. It's always harder to fight instinct when he's cold and hungry, and it's been a long time since he's felt even remotely safe in another person's company, as a cat or otherwise. When Eraserhead sat down with crossed legs, Izuku curled up in his lap, desperate for the heat and the unbelievable sense of comfort that comes from a person's palm gliding over his fur, petting and occasionally scratching itches he didn't even know he had until they were gone. It's warm and comfortable, and the feeling of being surrounded he desperately needs after his nightmare. Even days later, the ache of terror in his chest is still there. Only now, under the light touch of gentle stroking down his back, is it starting to subside the tiniest bit. For once he doesn't mind the rumbling of his chest. He'll freak out later about what the hell this is and why he's immediately made himself at home on Eraserhead's lap, while the hero is on duty, just because he's petting Izuku. But not right now. That's for later. Right now is only for warmth, well-placed scratches, and a flood of relief dipping him in exhaustion like he's a fresh-made caramel apple the moment he doesn't have to think or be alone anymore. His entire body melted into a puddle of fur as he laid in the nest of a human heater. He doesn't have the energy to overthink how weird this is as his eyes pull themselves closed like heavy curtains. He doesn't care if it's weird. It's nice. And if he's secretly glad that cats can't shed tears because of emotion, no one will know. It's been so long since he's had this comfort from another person. He knows that's not what the hero is trying to do, but it's okay to pretend, right? If it's just for a moment. If he closes his eyes, he can pretend the fingers are his mom's. Soft and kind, grooming his dirty, blackened fur. You're more cuddly than most strays. Did you belong to someone, little guy? The hero's voice stopped Izuku from drifting off, gruff and impassive, but he gets the feeling that's just how the hero speaks because he doesn't sound put off in the slightest by having a dirty, presumably stray cat laying on him like a personal space heater just because he sat down and pet him. Izuku will find time to be embarrassed about this later as well, he always does. Right now, though there's no chance of stopping it, he has to concentrate on at least trying to keep the purring volume lower than a jet engine. He's starting to understand why Colby demands his attention so often. Just a few minutes of unexpected TLC and he feels so much better that he doesn't even care that the hunger pains are coming back. He can count on one hand how many times in his life he's been this calm and relaxed. The looming cloud of grief and dread that's persisted over him has finally cleared away. Even so, he doesn't want to get up yet. He knows he should, that he's probably bothering the hero, keeping him from doing what he needs to, but he just can't get himself to move. Surely Mr. Eraserhead would get up if he needed to, right? A hero isn't going to disregard his duty to protect and save people just because a stray cat has decided to doze on their lap, right? Unfortunately, just as Izuku finished comforting himself and putting his worries in check, the glass window of short-lived peace shattered through a scream. He shot out of Eraserhead's lap like he'd been electrocuted, almost tripping over his own paws. The man was up without hesitation, and before Izuku could even look at him, He was sprinting out of the alley towards the sound. Izuku didn't think before following him. Eraserhead is much faster than him, and he briefly thought about becoming a dog. But he spotted one of the cinder block walls that he knows will cut off the need to go around the convenience store that's blocking the path from where the screaming is. If he shifts to something else, there's no guarantee his dirt will cover everything, not to mention he'll definitely give himself away and get in trouble for public quirk usage, and he'll get arrested and they'll call his guardian and find out he ran away and they'll make him go back, and what happened just now with Eraserhead will also be weird and he'll have to explain why he cozied up to a pro hero without even thinking. And it would all be a huge mess. He barely slowed down enough to jump onto the wall and came out the other side in just a few seconds. He made it first, but he didn't expect Eraserhead to go over the top of the store instead of around it. It felt like the world slowed down. He watched Eraserhead's hair float with a flash of red from his goggles and the scarf shoot out like a striking snake. He's positive he didn't blink, but it happened so fast Izuku didn't see what actually happened. The person was robbing the clerk at the back door of the convenience store 1 second, and the next they were a scarf burrito falling on the ground, their startled shout coming a second later. In less than a minute, Eraserhead clicked quirk cuffs on them, asked the clerk if they were okay, and had his phone out, calling for a police pickup. That was so fast. Izuku's seen a lot of hero fights, and some are very short, but he's never seen a takedown that lasted less than a minute before. There's so much, and yet so little he can analyze here. It was so swift and simple and so effective. A petty criminal didn't stand a chance against that amount of skill. They were even slower to realize what happened than Izuku. Izuku was so caught up in the fight that it takes several seconds to realize he knows this clerk. It's one of the part-timers who will sneak him fish treats sometimes when they're in a good mood. While the store clerk thanked Eraserhead and they waited for the police to arrive, Izuku takes his chance to slip away before he's noticed, brain whirring for a notebook to break down everything he saw and the flood of ideas of how Eraserhead's quirk is so useful and the genius of his support gear. His fighting style is utterly unique, being built around his scarf like it's an extension of his own body, like an artificial quirk, but not entirely reliant on it either. Unbeknownst to him, a pair of black eyes behind yellow goggles spotted a certain curious, skittish, brave little cat leaving after the action was over. Izuku got home and couldn't stop himself from scooping up frosting and rambling to the uninterested white cat at the speed of light. He actually got to watch Eraserhead fight. The other day it was too dark and he was too on edge, and the dumpster had blocked his view, but this time he actually got to see it. Heroes are incredible. That's gonna be him someday, and he wants to be just as good as Eraserhead. He was too excited to sleep much that night, but at least he didn't have nightmares. Izuku's determination took a shot of jet fuel after seeing that fight. He barely slept 6 hours a day for a week, spending every waking moment possible figuring out what he can do to prepare for the UE exam. Studying ahead where he can, coming up with ways to use his quirk to end fights as quickly as possible, which he always comes back to ambushing because you can't prepare to counter something you don't know is coming for you, or brainstorming support equipment that could be just as useful for him as Eraserhead's scarf. He doesn't want to outright copy Eraserhead's scarf, but it's so useful. As much as Izuku analyzes quirks and how they can be used as a hero, he doesn't seem to have the same gift for support equipment. The farthest he gets is identifying the problem that would need gear and what the gear would need to accomplish, but as far as what kind of gear that is, he draws a blank. The one thing he really needs to focus on, though, is stockpiling. He's not going to have enough time to go hunting and scavenging every day as the exam gets closer, and even less time for it when he's actually taking the exam. His only solution was to take risks he normally wouldn't, eat a little bit less until the exam period, and just collect and store as much as he can. Being hungry when he goes to sleep makes it hard to stay asleep. It makes him think about when hunger wasn't a problem he thought he'd ever have, but he shut it down whenever it started. Sometimes annoying his cats so much they bapped him and ran off. Colby even sat on him when Izuku's constant movement annoyed him too much, and he spent half an hour with agitated tail swishes in his face and a 20-pound cat on his chest, but it made him feel better, so it was worth it. He's spending less time in the cat house though, and the Clouder is not happy about that, practically dogpiling him every time he comes back. Izuku dozed on his favorite dumpster lid, not quite asleep enough to dream, but not awake enough to just be remembering. It was that weird realm in between the two, reliving arguably the best or one of the worst days of his life, depending on his mood and if he's eaten in the last 15 hours. He remembers how his arms curled tighter around his legs, and burying his cold nose into his knees, careful to avoid the stinging scrapes. How the hair on his arms and legs stood on end, prickling as goosebumps ran up and down his grimy skin. The texture of it being interesting under his dirty fingernails and serving as a mild distraction from the tooth-chattering cold that he still uses sometimes these days. He's grateful he had his jacket. The once pale blue, now dirty and faded but still recognizable with a few holes where the fabric has worn thin, the gray strings that were once white as snow. His red shoes are still too big even with 2 pairs of socks, but they're better than the gray ones he found. Those pinched his feet and gave him blisters. He shuffled his feet closer, squeezing his back against the spot on the bricks that's warmed up from sitting here. The bricks cool down way too fast if he moves even just a little bit, and exposes the alley wall to the chilly air. The wind swirled by, sending shivers up and down his arms and legs. It wouldn't be so cold if it wasn't for its icy bite. Izuku huddled closer to the cardboard box next to him, hiding him from the eyes of the street. His fingers and toes went numb a long time ago, but they're starting to ache and he squeezed them tight together, burying them against his stomach trying to restore whatever warmth he could. His shoulders are stuck to his ears while he stares at the street, as high as he can get them, and the crick in his neck from nearly having his chin to his sternum will surely give him hell for days. There aren't many people out anymore, just the stragglers of the nightlife. Drunks, thieves, night shift workers all trying to make their way home in the slim hours before dawn. His stomach grumbled as his gaze caught on the convenience store across the street. The fluorescent light hurts his eyes even from this distance, but his empty stomach twists with a sharp stab of pain, staring longingly through the storefront windows at the rows of shelves lined with bags and cans and wrapped pre-made meals. A loud growl clawed its way from his gut to the outside world as he unconsciously smacked his lips, swallowing the spit building in his mouth. His dry throat made it hurt to swallow, but the saliva made it impossible not to. He pried his eyes away from the store, fixing them on the frigid concrete in front of his feet. He's hungry, but he's been hungry before. He knows he can hold out until tomorrow at least before dumpster diving for leftovers will start to sound like a good idea. If he gets some water from the fountain in the park in the morning, he can hold on until tomorrow afternoon before he'll start to throw up. Or you could sneak into the house and get both before Fukudashi wakes up from his hangover. Izuku's stomach growled again on cue. Maybe it isn't such a bad idea. Winter is coming, and if he doesn't find someplace warm to hole up, he won't have a choice but to go back there. He sniffled, breathing into his sleeve, feeling the goosebumps on his skin tingle as the warm air is trapped in the fabric, but the heat fades far too quickly. He shifted, wrapping his arms around himself and rubbing them through his ratty jacket. The temperature drops more every few minutes, settling into his bones and bringing the cold wash of dread with it. He doesn't want to have to go back to the house, but if it gets any colder, he won't have a choice. Mr. Fukudashi didn't notice the last time he went back. He was even able to sneak into the kitchen and get some food before sneaking out again. He sniffled again and rubbed his red nose on his knees, eyes prickling and stinging. He doesn't want to go back. He knows what'll happen if he does. If he gets caught. A phantom pang ached through his ribs and arms. The bruises from last time faded days ago, but every time he gets caught going back, it's worse than the time before. Mr. Fukudashi doesn't care where he is or where he's been, as long as he does what he's told and doesn't say a word he isn't told to. Izuku's ankle still throbs when he thinks about the time they almost got caught by a hero. He's still not sure whether to be thankful or resent that Mr. Fukudashi is a good liar, and the hero was more focused on catching the non-existent Mother Fukudashi sent them on a wild goose chase after than making sure Izuku was okay. He shuddered and sniffled harder, rubbing his arms again. He doesn't want to think about that. He jumped at a soft clang down the alley, head whipping to the side and eyes darting to the source. The panic shooting adrenaline through his muscles because the last time he was startled like this it was a shady back alley deal that he barely escaped unnoticed from. It could be that again, or worse, a villain. Rapidly spiraling thoughts came to an abrupt halt as several pairs of reflective eyes stared back at him. A pair of slit jade green met his and his eyelids disappeared into his skull as he blinked. He's never seen a cat that big in his life. It looks like a medium-sized dog put on a cat costume. Maybe it's not a cat, it could be a young tiger that escaped from the zoo or something. His eyes trailed to the cat's dirty, stormy gray fur, noting at least 3 different shades of the color that, probably, aren't dirt, and the pockets of matting among the otherwise long and fuzzy fur. He can't help a prickle of envy as he looks at it, as he looks at the cats piled up over there curling around each other, half of them sleeping soundly while the rest lounge. I bet it's warm. His gaze drifted to an old tin can, still wobbling on the ground as 2 new cats strode up behind it, one of them looking at the can like the thing personally offended it but can't be bothered to make it pay any more than it already has. Before they piled up with the others without hesitation, being welcomed into the fold simply by virtue of being another cat. The big, massive, gray cat is the only one that hasn't joined the pile now. It's just sitting there, proudly, staring at Izuku with the end of its tail flicking up and down in gentle, lazy motions. Like a metronome. It's mesmerizing in a way. With all that fur, Izuku wouldn't be surprised if the cat isn't cold at all, even with this brisk wind sweeping into the alley. Izuku's own green eyes moved back to the pile of cats and felt a pang strike through his chest. If only he had fur to keep him warm. If he was a cat, would they let him walk over and join the warm pile too? That would be nice. He could have an au naturel fur coat to keep him warm, and eyes that make the dark not so scary, and he wouldn't have to worry about finding somewhere to sleep where people won't chase him off and cops or heroes wouldn't find him and send him back to the foster house, or worse, back into the system for a new placement. The system is bad enough for normal kids, but when you add Quirkless to anything it's amazing how fast things get worse. It's like black magic. He physically aches with envy for the alley cats. Even if they don't have homes, they still have somewhere they're accepted. They don't have to belong to huddle together for the night. They just need to be a familiar cat and that's enough. The tingling in his fingers and toes worsened and Izuku's head swam, his vision going wonky. He's felt dizzy from hunger before, but not this soon. He squeezed his eyes shut and buried his face in his knees, trying to chase away the tipping feeling, prickles racing all over his body like he rolled in hay. Closing his eyes helps a tiny bit as the dizziness fades, his stomach even feels a little better. With his face curled down like this, it's warmer too. His clothes feel like they cover him a little more, his jacket laying over him like a blanket. Wait. His jacket's not big enough for that. Izuku jumped as a low, dare he say satisfied meow echoed above him and his head snapped up just in time for the gray cat. Did it get bigger? Does it have a quirk? Is that why it's so big? Or is it just bigger up close? Came striding up next to him. Izuku's breath hitched as it plopped down right next to him, its front leg big enough to lay over him completely as the cat settled down on top of the jacket he's under. Confusion swarmed him like a fish caught in a net, staring at the pile of clothes around him, all of them much bigger than they should be, but all he can focus on is the unexpected heat from the furry feline that's somehow big enough to cover his entire body, and has decided to grace him with their warming presence. He has the strangest sense that he's just been adopted by a big grumpy cat. A shiver raced down his spine and the small boy unconsciously snuggled closer to the living space heater as his eyes began to droop, his shaking body desperate to soak in the heat like a warm bath, surrounded by still warm clothes that smell like something he can only describe as his own smell underneath the dirt, sweat, and little hints of dried blood from his scrapes. His nose tickles and his first thought is the cat's fur, until his head that feels like it's being weighed down sank and his chin met his forearm. His fuzzy forearm. Wrestling his hazy mind singing a siren song of sleep, Izuku tried to pull it back from that drifting edge and look down. It took a moment to register what he's looking at. The tiny paws under him that he knows are somehow his because he can feel them, and when he tried to wiggle them, they moved. The deep green-black outside of the direct light from the street carried a dull shimmer almost like velvet, its shade identical to his hair. Izuku stared at the fuzzy arms in front of him uncomprehending, but the only coherent thought he could form was, fur is warm, before a deep rumbling vibration all along his back pulled his sore eyes closed. He couldn't tell if the purring was the big cat, himself, or both before he was carried away into the warm darkness. A soft thunk hit the ground and Izuku startled awake on his dumpster lid, no alley floor under him or buried in a warm pile of worn clothes, or the huge fuzzy Colby of so long ago laying on him. His slit eyes locked on the figure barely a meter from him, and his jackrabbiting heart instantly calmed its attempts to escape the cage of his chest. If he could hyperventilate in this form, he might have. Gods, did he have to do that? He scared the crap out of him. Sorry, buddy. Didn't mean to scare you. Eraser casually leaned his side against the edge of the dumpster, slow and non-intrusive in his approach to Izuku, like usual. Izuku resisted the urge to glance around. Spooky. If he wasn't positive that Eraserhead can't hear his thoughts, he would have thought the man has a secondary telepath quirk. He does have a subtle secondary quirk, but it's not telepathy. Izuku chirped a cat's equivalent of a sigh and let his head thunk back down, letting his booming, startled heart stop beating up his veins. He's long past thinking Eraserhead has any idea that he's not a real cat, or that he intends to snatch him off to a shelter. As confusing as it is, and as much as he doesn't understand it, the man just seems to like cats. Strays especially. Izuku has seen him feeding and petting others in the area a couple times, but somehow he always manages to find Izuku the most often, and almost always when he's just managed to relax. Which isn't easy for him. He flinched when small warm pressures gently glided down his upper back, but quickly relaxed. He's more than familiar enough to identify Eraserhead's fingers by now without even looking. He curled his paws under his cheek and closed his eyes, going back to, he wouldn't say pleasant dozing, but it wasn't terrible. Honestly, it's probably a good thing that his thoughts were interrupted before he fell asleep. But he's also a little unhappy because he was right on the brink of sleep. Wonderful, beautiful, problem-solving and usually not painful sleep. Sleep fixes a lot of his problems. Hungry? Take a nap. Headache? Take a nap. Nightmare? Stay up for a little while then take a nap. Sad? Take a nap. Lonely? Take a nap. There's no end to the problems that sleep can solve. The slow, involuntary rumbling of his chest started as Mr. Eraserhead scratched behind his ears, and gradually used more of his palm to pet him until his entire hand settled in a comfortable rhythm on Izuku's back. This is starting to become a routine. He's been seeing Eraserhead every couple of days for weeks now. Maybe it's because he's been out more often and not spending nearly as much time at the cat house. But Eraser always has treats, and a couple times he even had a little bag of chicken in his pocket for some reason. Izuku thinks he brings snacks with him on patrol, but usually it's those fruity-smelling pouches. Izuku won't complain. It's been very helpful for getting him through the night on his fasting days. He kind of felt a little bad, maybe, for taking up so much of the hero's time so recently. When he started petting Izuku, he didn't stop him or hiss or anything. Just because he felt bad. Not because it's nice or anything. He's not trying to be selfish or distract the hero. If Eraserhead wants to pet him, he lets him. He doesn't go demanding or seeking it out or anything, not like Colby does. Izuku's eyes scrunched and head emptied like magic as the hero's fingers somehow managed to scratch his entire head all at once. There is no greater feeling than being blessed by a cat. It's official as far as Should is concerned, this skittish little guy has deemed him safe. The fact the juvenile jumped and then went straight back to dozing without a care the moment he saw him proves how much trust he's built. The fact he recognized him was a high in and of itself, but he's even letting Shoyuta touch him without any fuss or vigilance now. That's victory. If he keeps this up, he might let Shoyuta finally get him off the street to a place that will take care of him. He's a decently healthy kitten as far as he can tell, if a bit thin, and enjoys his dust baths a little too much, judging by how Shuta's hand is always covered in unidentified black dirt every time he pets him. It won't be hard for him to get adopted. Unfortunately, centuries-old stigma still exists, and black cats are the least likely to get adopted and most likely to be put down. If Hisashi wouldn't kill him for bringing home another stray cat instead of taking them to a shelter first, he would already be trying to get this little guy accustomed enough to take him home. No, he is not getting attached. Not even when the kitten's head lulled into his hand when he scratched his chin. He held in a sigh, not wanting to startle the kitten again. He has to follow their agreement and take the little guy to a shelter first. If he doesn't get adopted within 3 months and he's still attached, then Shoyuta can bring him home. Curse his past self for sneaking home one too many half-feral cats without Hisashi knowing. He knows Hisashi would adore this little guy. He'd be attached in a heartbeat. He always puts up a fuss about another cat, but it's never more than a few hours before he's even more attached than Shoyuta. Especially if it's a cuddly cat like Fruit Dip. He needs to come up with a name for this kitty though. The ones they come up with at the shelter are terrible. Utter abominations of normality that should never be within 20 feet of a cat's title. But what should he call him? What suits this cautious, little rumbling, criminal terrorizer? Shoyuta brushed the pad of his thumb over the kitten's cheek under its closed eyes, feeling the purr through his hand and the vibrating from the plastic dumpster lid through his wrist. If it wasn't so adorable, the bellowing in the mostly empty dumpster might even be ominous. He's got it. How do you feel about Cthulhu? The cat lifted his head to stare at him with eyes that flashed an almost acid green in the light from the end of the alley. This is it. Everything he's been doing comes down to what happens right now. The difference between getting into Yui and moving towards his future, and watching the painstakingly salvaged crumbs of his life finally scatter to the wind. He can do this. He can do this. He can do this. He can do this. Just breathe. It's not technically breaking and entering, he's not breaking anything. And well, he is entering, but, oh man, he doesn't want to do this. No. No, he has to. Where else is he gonna find animals that are useful for being a hero? A cat is great and all, dogs have their uses too, and all sorts of other everyday animals can be used for gathering information and stealth and all that, but he's got nothing suited for fighting, for combat. He has to do this. He tried to find animals to add to his roster the legal way mostly legal, but there's no time left. The entrance exam is the day after tomorrow, and he's come all this way already. He officially ran the clock down to the wire. And it's not like the animals aren't used to people, them being here in the first place is more damaging than what he's about to do. They're not even gonna notice him, they'll all be asleep. Yeah, they'll be asleep. And Izuku will be too small anyway. It's not like they stop actual wildlife from going in and out, it's an open-air place, at least the pictures on the website showed as much. Izuku won't make a difference, he won't disturb the animals. It'll be a lot better than a person sneaking in to pet the animals they're not supposed to. They won't even know he was there, he's not hurting anyone or anything. Yeah. Okay. Before he could talk himself out of it again, Izuku's body shifted with a slight tingling sensation into a tiny green bird and flew out of the bushes past the dark wood sign inlaid with friendly letters, "Welcome to Fuji Safari Park." Izuku was scared to death and in complete awe from the moment he stepped through the open gates of Yui and couldn't take his eyes off of the massive gleaming building. Not only is the building itself an impressive marvel of architecture, but what it represents and the people found in its halls are even more so. He tripped, but a girl was nice enough to catch him with her quirk, something to do with inertia negation maybe, and after that, he decided to stare at his feet like usual as he walked instead of gawking at the building, his face burning with embarrassment on top of his nausea all the way to the exam hall. His hands shook as he got registered at the desk, and he'd like to say it was just nerves about the exam, but that would be a bald-faced lie, as socially anxiety is an unfortunate thing and the person checking examinees in is pro-hero pathfinder. He knew intellectually that Yui is a school full of heroes, and he had done what he now recognizes as probably a poor job of preparing himself for that, to not freak out and embarrass himself, but well, that ship has sailed. He hadn't thought the people signing examinees in would be the first heroes he saw, and well-known ones at that. Then again, that may have been deliberate. The principal of Yui is pro-hero Nedzu, who has an intelligence quirk, so it's entirely possible that they have well-known heroes signing the examinees in on purpose. It would serve as a number of things: a deterrent on people trying to sneak in, a reminder that cheating isn't the best idea, a PR thing, even to just get examinees over the shock factor of seeing pro-heroes in person, because Izuku can't imagine that many of the people here for the exam are accustomed to seeing pro-heroes up close in person. Izuku certainly isn't. While letting his thoughts run away to help calm down, he found his seat in the massive auditorium and spent the next 20 minutes tangling and squeezing his fingers within an inch of their life, the blood flow rapidly, turning his fingers all shades of white, red, and purple, while the rest of the exam hall filled, and finally the tests were passed out by pro-hero ectoplasm. He fumbled out a thank you when receiving his test and tried not to freak out internally when the pro-clone nodded in response. Thankfully, the hero is already behind him, so the man didn't see how red he knows his face must be right now. He listened to the instructions for the written test, pacing his breaths to calm down as much as possible, and while it doesn't help much, it helps enough. He has trouble with crowds at the best of times, but there are so many people in here, in front of him, behind him, everyone looking around and looking at him, whether it's a passing glance or a lingering one. It raises his hackles. He can feel his fur, hair on his skin standing on end, and through the entire exam he has to keep reminding himself that he's fine and safe as he worked his way through questions. Nothing is gonna happen to him in a room full of pro-heroes and hundreds of examinees taking their high school entrance exam. Nobody who applies to this school is willing to risk their shot of getting in just to mess with someone they don't know. He's fine. It's all good. No matter the reassurances he tells himself, though, he can't shake the feeling he's being watched and can't help looking around every time the feeling hits, and more often than not, he finds someone at least looking in his direction, but it feels like it's coming from somewhere else. The horrible nausea that's followed him from this morning keeps getting worse, even though he made sure to eat more than usual so he has energy for the tests. It's not the lack of food or even the test anxiety that's making him sick and uneasy. It's definitely that he knows for a fact kids from his old school and kids from his area of the city, ones that have tried to attack him and his clouder before, are sitting in this hall, and he can see a few of them from here. He can reason to himself till the sun goes down that they won't recognize him, that they've got their own worries and nerves to deal with right now, but that won't account for after the test. How many of them are taking the hero portion of the exam? It has to be at least half. This is the top hero school in the country, and although their acceptance rate is low, their application rate is higher than most colleges. He knows there's cameras in here too because he keeps looking up at the ceiling rafters above the fluorescent lights and occasionally sees a small red light. He'd guess a rotating camera that's probably looking for cheaters, which doesn't help the nauseous burning in his stomach every time it turns his way, even though he knows he isn't cheating. His luck has always been abysmal enough that he can't even reason that it would be easy to prove he wasn't if he was accused. It's probably suspicious how often he's looking around, but he can't stop himself. He feels eyes on him. He has to look. It's automatic. Which means he finds himself looking up, directly at that red light, and flinching so hard his toes popped, immediately returning his eyes to his paper more often than he'd like. When he was finally done with his exam, he still couldn't relax, and won't until he's tucked safely in the cat house listening to the ocean and brushing soft fur under his fingers. But his shoulders dropped several centimeters as soon as he finished checking his answers a third time, and just has to wait. Waiting has always been hard, but he thinks he's gained a lot of patience in his time as a cat. After what felt like a lifetime of actual hell, the exam was finally over, and there was an odd sweep of solidarity through the hall as everyone seemed to let out a collective sigh of relief. The booklets were collected again by ectoplasm cyclones, so cool. And he remembered to say thank you again, even though it was a bit quiet and with a false start, but it was only one, so he won't burn with embarrassment for too long. He hopes. When the tests were collected, everyone not taking the hero exam was directed out of the auditorium and to their designated test areas for whatever course they were going for. The lights dimmed after their departure, with a truly impressive number of examinees still in the room. He mentally reminded himself of the 3 steps he broke this day down into to help control his nerves. The written, the practical, getting home. Repeating that like a mantra has helped keep his shaking under control. That and curling and uncurling his hands, the fabric of his pants on his thighs, kneading his sore hands the same way cats, including himself, make biscuits. The action was a lot more comforting than the breathing, but the combination of both, plus the lights dimming, finally took the slightest bit of edge off. He doesn't like being so visible and out in the open, but he never would have even thought about the fluorescent lighting making him more nervous if they hadn't turned the lights down. 1 part down, 2 parts to go. Breathe in. Breathe out. Squeeze. Release. He felt so bad for not responding to present Mike, as the hero proctor called a greeting out to the hall. But if he even tries to open his mouth right now, he's going to throw up, and he can barely focus through the blender of anxiety in his belly. Nevertheless, he was able to power through it and listen as carefully as possible to the explanation of the practical. He's not sure what he expected, but it wasn't robots and a mock urban battle, though he knew without a doubt that combat of some kind was going to be part of it. Combat is an unavoidable part of heroics. Izuku almost threw up when a student stood up and interrupted the pro-hero's explanation. It wasn't even him who did it, and he still curled in on himself, the instinct to draw as little attention as possible so strong that he actually felt his quirk bristle in preparation and had to consciously slam on the brakes to stop himself from transforming. He doesn't even want to think about what would happen if he used his quirk in public, in the middle of a school full of pro-heroes right before the hero exam. He'd probably be lucky if he just got kicked out and they didn't call Fukidashi or his social worker to come get him. At worst, they could arrest him. He was far more grateful than reasonable when the presentation was over, and couldn't help admiring Present Mic's ability to deal with the situation so smoothly, smooth enough that Izuku only noticed after the fact. And finally he was following the flow of prospective students and the group number he was dedicated to the assigned buses that will take them to the practical testing grounds. There were about 5 buses that came back at least twice before Izuku got on his own bus, and while he squeezed his fingers and choked back nausea during the ride, when they arrived, over a dozen contestants stood in front of the testing ground already. He's ashamed to admit that he wouldn't have thought to stretch in the meantime if he wasn't watching nearly half the people here doing just that. But he made a point to remember it from now on as he did some basic stretching that middle school had them do. He doesn't typically need to warm up as a cat to go hunting, but stretching as a cat is a delightfully pleasant sensation, so it tends to be something he does throughout the day anyway. Stretching right now proved to be the right call because he's more tense than he realized. He hates to think what would have happened if he didn't loosen up before he goes on whatever mad dash for points this will be. He had trouble with obstructing his view of everyone, and couldn't stop himself from constantly looking around. But he did see the nice girl from earlier and briefly considered going up to her to wish her luck, and maybe he would have, if he didn't see the boy from earlier between them, and any scrap of courage he might have mustered to interact with another person recoiled immediately. As his muscles pulled taut and loosened, Izuku's blood began to circulate away from his face for a change. The nervous sweat sped along the cooling of his cheeks, and with each breath having to contort to the stretching, the anxious cloud over his mind began to shift. This is a mock villain attack in an urban area, which means there's several things he'll need to watch out for in addition to keeping track of his points while he fights. Namely the other examinees. He's going to have to snap-analyze their quirks to avoid getting caught in the line of fire. Just like his first day of middle school when he didn't know half the kids who had something to say about him being quirkless. He hates doing snap reads, but it's better than nothing. There's gonna be over a dozen people running around and they're shooting off quirks they have no experience using around other people. There's going to be mishaps, and he can't afford to end up in a hospital for so many reasons. He will miss the exam if he tries to list them all. Speaking of lists, he straightened up, running down the mental list of his transformation options as he scanned the crowd around him looking for clues about people's quirks. Some of them were obvious, some took a little more subtle scrutiny, and some he surprisingly recognized. The scary blue-haired boy. He didn't see the engines in his legs before, but as soon as he did, he immediately knew who the boy was. He's 90% sure that boy isn't Ida, A legacy hero family. No wonder he's so strict. He must have pretty high standards and… Izuku tried not to grimace outwardly. He has probably been training with actual pro heroes his entire life. He tried not to curl in on himself or get discouraged, because that's amazing. But that's also at least one person he has almost no chance of beating for a slot in the hero course. And this is just one arena. There are at least 4 other arenas that he knows about, and he's not even sure if they're doing all the contestants at once or in groups. It would probably depend on how their point tracking is set up, 'cause there's no way they're going to leave that up to the examinees and take them at their word. Not with competition this fierce. This is going to be mayhem, a mad dash through a concrete jungle for any point he can get before someone else does. Fierce competition, in a jungle. That transformation could work. It's not too big, he could probably hold that transformation much better and for longer than the first thing he thought of. It's fast, powerful, agile, and a predator and predators are always a good choice for hunting. Hunting! Izuku perked up, resisting the urge to jump in place as the idea struck him. If he treats this like hunting, actually, now that he thinks about it, this pretty much is hunting. Competing for food and defending his prey is not much different from fighting other examinees for points. With that thought, a natural calm washed over him, his shoulders uncurling and rolling them as a tingle slid through his back muscles, flexing the way they do when he's a cat. Preparing for more lithe, graceful, and balanced movements than the clumsy, lumbering steps of controlled falling that human people do. Hunting is something he's good at. And with this animal, it won't even be that different. The movements of felines are something he's in tune with. Izuku jumped when present mix Quirk boomed from somewhere above him. Okay, start! Izuku could feel the confusion around him as he and everyone else present looked to the tower beside where they're all waiting, that he assumes is probably a control room of some sort. On top of the structure stood the voice hero with one foot up on the ledge of the building. Being a hero must rearrange the lines of self-preservation, if not erase them entirely. And get rid of any fear of heights someone may have. What's wrong? There are no count. The hero barely got the first words out before an electrifying tingle shot through Izuku's body and like slow motion, in what felt like ages and barely a few seconds at the same time. Every change sweeping through him with a prickling tingle like a sudden icy breeze. Green fur streaked with long black lines in a pattern that almost everyone on Earth would recognize sprouted from his skin, his ears moving and changing atop his head as he dropped forward, spine stretching, becoming longer and looser during his forward descent into what would have either been a good stance for push-ups, or a broken nose if his hands hadn't rippled and hit the ground as massive green paws instead. Much bigger than his usual ones. His once human nails reformed under fur and skin into razor-sharp retractable claws the size of large shark teeth. His eyesight shifted like it does when he's a cat, but then it didn't stop. Colors muting like a pair of yellow-tinted contacts had been slotted over his eyes. His spine finally stopped at the tip of a much stronger and longer tail than he's used to. All before the hero even finished his sentence. Downs in real fights! Run, run! The die has been cast, you know! Izuku felt it the moment his back paws got traction on the asphalt, and he lunged forward. Half on purpose and half on instinct, as many objects, people, darted away from him through the gate, triggering the familiar instinct to chase. The pull of that instinct is much more intense than he's felt before. It's so weird to be in a feline body and still be so high off the ground. To be so big, period. Not even his human shape is this big, and right now he's not just the size of a full-grown adult human, he can feel his own weight. He knows that he could not only knock down a full-grown adult, he could drag them for however long he wanted to, or rather, for however long his transformation lasts. He's never felt so strong in his life. Muscles he could only dream of having before rippling under his skin, making him feel light even though he knows for a fact that tigers are anything but. His paws make heavy thunderous impacts up his arms/legs every time they hit the ground as he darts forward, quickly outpacing the examinees he was following into the mock city. He's not sure if the gray colors of the city are real, because it's a fake city, and he's not sure how far UA went with the recreation of something that's just going to be destroyed. But there are signs and things that look like they should have a variety of bright colors, but they all just look green, and gray and yellow to him, and considering the other people are all in the same shades, he's going to assume it's a him problem. He did not, and could not have accounted for what color the robots are, or that their metal has a matte finish. Still, he's embarrassed to admit that if his eyes were not attuned to movement, he would not have even seen the robot that came around the corner to his right as he ran through the city looking for prey/robots. And he still jumped out of his skin, attacking it out of pure reflex. Paws the size of baseball mitts with thrice the strength collided with metal, a vicious shriek worse than nails on a chalkboard ripping through the noisy air as his claws raked down the front of the toppling robot. A plume of concrete and dust spurted into the air as the robot hit the pavement like a fridge dropped from a second-floor balcony, and landed with a booming thud that would have rattled his bones if they weren't so dense at the moment. Good to know his first instinct as a tiger is to attack instead of bolt like it is as a cat. He didn't have much time to recover before he lunged at another movement that zoomed towards him, and the second robot hit the ground with a resounding shriek of metal that echoed off the surrounding buildings. Only after his claws ripped the front paneling to ribbons did it occur to him that these robots are made to be defeatable by far less violent and powerful means than a tiger attack. In a word, they're fragile. Which means he doesn't have to expend much energy to destroy them if he gets a good momentum up, and just works to maintain it. An object in motion stays in motion and all that. He nodded to himself, resolving to try something, and didn't have to look far for more robots. He jumped at one robot, and then immediately to the next without stopping, and sure enough, his weight alone is enough to crush whatever important stuff is under the torso of these fragile partially humanoid robots. A happy growling purr rumbled in his ribcage like a jet engine, and he thought Colby's purrs were loud at the success. He didn't even need to use his claws really. He tried them out on the next ones anyway, totally not because he might never have a chance to after this or anything. It's just smart to test out all his abilities to choose the best methods, and it only took 2 well-placed slashes to the torso and 1 well-placed slash to the thin neck area to destroy the robots. The neck area was surprisingly easier to go for. It was an instinctual target. Weak points like the neck and legs of prey he's trying to kill and or disable to prevent escape feels like second nature, and he can't tell if that's solely natural instinct or if his own knowledge is playing any part. He's not sure how he would test it, or if it's even worth testing. Izuku actually forgot he wasn't just here to hunt a new type of prey and testing out what this transformation can do, until another examinee zoomed past him and shrieked like they'd seen a ghost. Izuku swiveled where he stood on top of a robot, and watched the boy with pointy spiraled hair spin on their heels so fast they almost fell over and hightail it back around a corner. Oh, right. Exam. At least it was far enough away from him that he isn't tempted to chase after them. A tiger's instincts are a little harder to rein in than a cat's. Izuku's mouth dropped open, saliva sliding off large teeth, feeling like ice water was just dumped over his head. Oh no! He forgot to keep track of his points. An unhappy whine escaped the anxious tiger, sounding far more dramatic than he meant to, and he ran off with renewed anxiety, continuing to chase down robots like mice in alleyways, and struggling to keep his count as he went. After the 3rd time he lost count, he gave up trying. It won't be accurate anymore no matter what he does, so there's no point in bothering. Pun not intended. A few more examinees screamed upon seeing him, and most of them jumped like they'd walked into a horror movie, booking it in a different direction at the sight of him. Izuku would blush if he could at the several times he had to abort a pursuit mid-pounce. There's just something about things that run that make him want to chase, you know? He knows he acknowledged it before, but he can't help saying it again. Controlling tiger instincts is really difficult. New transformations are always like this, they take a while to adjust to. Another reason why choosing a feline, whose movements are similar to something he's already used to, was a good idea that he wishes was on purpose instead of being a happy accident, but beggars can't be choosers. The bolder test-takers that only startled or paused at the sight of him started giving him a wide berth instead of outright fleeing the area to find robots elsewhere. And more were doing it by the second, So Izuku guesses that robots are getting hard to find. Does that mean the exam is nearing the end? How long has it been since they started? In his pursuit for robots, he's wound up somewhere near the middle again, with a direct line of sight to the entrance gate down the large main road he's standing in. It's kind of hard to tell the robots apart even after identifying key differences and being outright told before they began which ones are which, but he doesn't think he's run into any of those 0-point robots. And all the destroyed robots along the road are of the same 3 types as well, at least of the ones that are still intact enough to tell. It's a little disheartening to see how many other people here are capable of this amount of destruction. Even if he's right about the bots being deliberately fragile. He wandered between piles of metal avoiding patches of leaked oil and sparks searching for movement and robots, but with every second that he didn't see anything he grew more frantic. This arena is so much bigger than he could have imagined. He has to be almost half a mile from the entrance, and he's even wandered back from where he was farther out before. This would have been hell to traverse as a cat. There's no way he wouldn't have noticed wandering so far. It's far bigger than the size of his Clouder's territory. Tiger's territories must be much bigger than his initial guess because he doesn't even feel like he's wandered too far. Of course, that could just be due to the fact the place he would consider his den is way too far from here. Izuku made a mental note to learn more about tigers later. He's not quite sure how he'll manage that, but Yue has to have a library he can probably use to find out. If he gets in. Some of the point counts the other examinees are shouting around him are making him sweat. It's hard to determine what robots he's been destroying, especially when a lot of them end up unidentifiable after he's smushed and or slashed them. So he could have anywhere from dozens of points if he's been hunting 3-pointers, to under 30 if he's been hunting 1-pointers this whole time. His tail flicked side to side in agitation, nerves eating him alive as a dread anxiety cocktail sat heavy and swirling in his stomach. His rumbling stomach. All this hunting and the huge amount of energy he sunk into it, and not a single thing to eat. He shook his head, huffing out of his nose and growling unhappily. He huffed again, hanging his mouth open and letting his barbed tongue dry in the smoky taste of the nose-wrinkling air. Taste aside, it's a lot better than overheating. He's not sure if it's just because he's been moving around and fighting and worked up a sweat, which is different than how a human sweats to cool down, unfortunately. But he's a lot warmer than usual. His fur is so much warmer than when he's a cat. He can't remember the last time he was overheating. Note to self. Tiger temperature regulation is bad. Izuku let out a big yawn, stretching his mouth as wide as he could, tongue curling between serrated carnassial teeth. Despite the yawn, he's not as tired as he thought he would be from all this. After resting for a mere few seconds and trying to cool down via panting, he was back to hunting for more robots and having to resist the urge to go slowly and lumber his way so as not to spook prey and converse energy. What he wouldn't give to be able to use this transformation during the winter. He could keep the entire Clouder warm with the amount of heat he's putting off, assuming they didn't freak out and scatter in all directions, never to be seen again at the mere sight of him. If his theory about them knowing it's him because of smell, it's possible that they would recognize him after an initial scare. Or maybe if they saw him transform outside at a short distance first? That seemed to work better when they were getting accustomed to his transforming in the first place. He hasn't really done any other regular transformations near them though, aside from when he runs out of energy and doesn't exactly choose the smaller thing he winds up as. He's always been away from the cat house, hunting, or trying to, when he tried different things. They've never attacked him before, but being smaller than a cat probably has a much different reaction than being even bigger than an adult human, being a predator this big. Izuku froze as the ground began to rumble like the beginnings of an earthquake. He jumped out of his skin, ears flattening against his head as booming popping noises burst and shot plumes of brown smoke and dust into the air. A harsh, repetitive grating noise like a wagon 20 times his size with a squeaky wheel pierced the air, and Izuku's ears hurt as he heard dozens, possibly hundreds of glass windows shattering, raining sharp tink-s to the asphalt to assault his sensitive ears. A loud bang tore an unintentional threatening roar from his chest and sent his hackles raising, his entire posture curling like a tight spring, ready to pounce. A shadow loomed over the street, and he whipped around among gasps and froze. He hardly had a moment to think and process what he was seeing before all hell broke loose. Dust rushed past him with the pressure of an explosion, and concrete flew like hail the size of boulders, impacting the street, and suddenly he felt like a real villain is attacking. Screams filled the air, people shouting to run. Frantic examinees rushed past him like a river around a rock, all of them panicking. Only one thought came to mind for Izuku. Oh, that's the 0-pointer. Standing in a place he had wandered past no less than 3 times not even 5 minutes ago. Obstacle to be avoided, his furry stripped ass. Examinees sprinted towards the entrance like their lives depended on it. The whirring tread of tank-like wheels big enough to crush them like grapes behind them like a death toll. And just like the instinct Izuku has been fighting off and on since the moment he transformed, the robot towering over the buildings beside it gave chase. Not for the first time, Izuku's entire body shrieked with the bone-deep understanding that he is prey. His body moved on its own, instinct completely taking over as he whirled around, claws digging into the asphalt for as much traction as possible, exam forgotten and leaving only the breakneck thrumming of his heart, every muscle in his body pushing to the tune of the single concept screaming through his head like nothing else existed in his brain. Flee or die. And that's what he did. He ran like a true tiger would from a stampede. Like there were hounds and flames and the greatest predator of all nipping at his heels, death itself. It's a miracle he even heard it over the pounding of his own blood in his ears and the shrill alarm of survive and everything that came with it emptying his head of everything else. A tiger's hearing is sharp, so it's no wonder he's the only one who heard it. A sharp yelp through the chaos of the terrified, trampling retreat, and whirring of machinery. Of the pounding of concrete hitting the ground in chunks big enough to take someone's head off their shoulders, raining on all sides of the street like a meteor shower. With eyes attuned to movement and little color to distract, he immediately zeroed in on a single spot of struggling, dusty yellow among a pile of jagged gray rock. Tigers aren't just strong and fast, they're agile. It was like his instincts that had been driving him switched to an entirely different set, but still no thought was had. Thick claws dug into the asphalt, and like a true big cat, Izuku's entire body banked, not losing a single thread of momentum as he switched directions, his body twisting and tilting like a motorcycle on a highway, doing a complete 180. Within moments of spotting her, a blur of green and black stripes shot past in the opposite direction of examinees he had just run past. The reverb of his paws hitting the ground sent shocks all the way through his shoulders as he ran full speed down the street directly towards the smattering of yellow, and towards the danger. Seconds blurred all sense of time, only being measured in each burst of strength his legs could give him until Izuku reached the girl. If she screamed upon seeing him, he couldn't hear it, as her flinch coincided with the giant robot punching the street again, and sending a wave of dust rushing past and several golf ball-sized chunks of debris to hit his flank, but he refused to let it distract him. He's stronger than he's ever been, but no matter what he thought of, he couldn't find a way to push the debris with his paws without hurting her in such a short amount of time. The tread of the 0-pointer was like a countdown from hell. He needs something more precise, something prehensile like the monkey's he has, but strong enough, like, aha! As soon as it crossed his mind, the tiger's fur rippled, the hair disappearing like it was never there, folding in and expanding. The tingle burst through Izuku like a star at a dizzying pace as his line of sight shot up like he'd been thrown into the air. His paws flattening and ballooning and already strong legs thickened like tree trunks with knees, teeth became tusks and the anxious huffing burst into a near-frantic trumpet. Dull green skin stretched, and in a handful of milliseconds an elephant stood where a tiger once had. Izuku had no time to process the girl's startled shout, or the face she was making, just that it was somewhere between fear and nausea, both feelings he's intimately familiar with. His trunk moved as easily as he could his human arm with only a slight fumble as he slid it under the slab of concrete, and in a snap decision, instead of just flipping it off of her, Izuku swung his head to the side at the same time and flung it. A reverberating clang boomed through the mock street, louder than a car crash, like 100 square foot empty metal barrel had been struck by lightning, as the debris slammed into the head of the zero-pointer. Izuku was too busy to spare a glance with this form's stiff range of motion even when only a few seconds later an even bigger crash, one that shook the ground, followed. He wrapped his trunk around the girl and all but snatched her off the ground, curling her under his chin behind his tusks to protect her from the rain of debris pelting his back, and ran. The ground shook and cracked for an entirely different reason as Izuku's thunderous steps on the street betrayed his desperate retreat. Despite the heavy pounding movements that shook his entire body with every step, he concentrated on keeping the girl as stable as he could until he got far enough that he didn't feel the skitters of danger on his back anymore. Far enough that it didn't feel like something was unloading a Gatling gun of marbles into his back. Only then did he finally take a moment to think and listen, and he was greeted with a dizzying relief at the lack of whirring. Not just a loud one from the zero-pointer, but none anywhere. Izuku finally breathed, which was a little hard with how the girl's jacket suctioned to the end of his trunk. It's probably safe enough to put her down now. Probably. Holding a single transformation for so long, the entire practical so far, was hard. It's the only reason he was even able to do the elephant without even stopping to think about it. But this transformation really is just too big, and this handful of a couple dozen frantic seconds burned over half the energy he had left at a rate fast enough he can physically feel it burning away, like paper in a bonfire. He barely had time to stretch his trunk and put the girl down, and she let go of his super-sensitive trunk before his head swam. It's so weird to have such a prehensile extra limb with almost the same dexterity and feeling as his human hands. He's proud of himself for getting the both of them clear, but he really pushed it with this. The ground shook as the elephant staggered and pulled the barely risen girl back down. An alarm trumpet vibrated through his trunk in a weak attempt to alert what was about to happen as Izuku lilted to the side. He felt the tingling shoot through his sore body like an electric net. Sometimes he wonders if this is what getting tossed feels like. The ground shook again with the slamming of his foot as he tried to catch himself from a stumble, before he felt the free-falling sensation of rapidly becoming smaller. As the ground rushed towards him, the darkness at the edges of his vision rushed to the center. He barely felt the impact of his own body before it swallowed him.